الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والآقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء المرسلين أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ولا تهنوا ولا تحزنوا وأنتم الأعلون إن كنتم مؤمنين صدق الله العظيم. First of all, جزاكم الله خيرا to all the brothers and sisters for attending today. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this a blessed gathering. And جزاكم الله خيرا to our Sheikh Mirazim for the recitation of the Quran, and to our special guest, Brother Nadeem Ahmed, for attending today, taking his time out. Today's topic is about mental health and especially depression. I'd like to begin by mentioning that the Quran recognizes humans' emotional states, and it actually discusses and mentions different emotions and emotional states in the Quran. From the top of my head, the different emotions that we can find in the Quran is fear, sadness, anger, happiness, contentment, disappointment, betrayal, love, displeasure, certainty, uncertainty, hope, enthusiasm, determination, shame, guilt, sickness of the heart, covering of the minds, desires, lust, and other emotional states. The reason why I think it's important to understand emotions and its impact on human behavior is because it directly affects and has an impact on a person's faith and belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Emotional well-being means to have a balance of the soul, the mind and the body. What we refer to in Islamic terms as the ruh, the qalb and the nafs. The ruh refers to the soul, the qalb refers to the heart or the intellect, and the nafs refers to the ego, the self or the psyche. These are concepts that we find have been discussed by Islamic scholars such as Imam al-Ghazali radiallahu anhu. And we understand that when all three of these states are in balance, then what we find is a balance in human nature. Okay, and in our emotional well-being. And when there's an imbalance in any of these three entities, then there's an imbalance overall in humans. When a person's emotions are in balance, a person feels like worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and a person can feel the spirituality, right? And a person wants to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when a person's emotional state is imbalanced, then a person's faith and belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also impacted. And imbalance also has an impact on a person's relationship, life, career, friendship, goals. In fact, it affects every aspect of life. This is why I believe today's topic is important to discuss and to raise awareness about. Although the Quran does not mention the word depression, and in the Quran there's no equivalent word for depression, and I'll mention later why. There are depression. When I say depression, as is understood by in the medical or the psychological terms, the Quran uses different words for sadness, and often these different words, they highlight different levels and intensity of sadness. There are about 6 ways sadness is expressed in the Quran, and these terms, they express this emotion in various layers, right? For example, we have the word gham, right? This is a form of sadness, but we can also describe this as distress, right? And this is a form of sadness that temporarily blocks out a person's ability to see all the good that's around them, but for sure, gham, it passes, right? In the Arabic language, we call clouds ghamam, right? Why? Because they block out the sunlight. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ثُمَّ أَنزَلَ عَلَيْكُم مِّن بَعْدِ الْغَمِّ أَمَنَةً. After distress, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He sent security and peace upon you, right? This was sent to the believers at the Battle of Uhud, who were overcome with an overbearing form of sadness after certain events. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He motivated them to overcome this distress and this form of sadness. right? We also have the word huzn in the Quran. And this is we can describe this as the polar opposite of happiness, right? And this has attached to it a sense of anxiety with it. And huzn, it sets in when a person has high hopes or plans which are destroyed by external factors, right? And there's no sort of hope, a person assumes there's no hope for rectification or cure. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He speaks about Yaqub alayhi salam, the father of Yusuf alayhi salam, and He says, وَابْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ, that the eyes of Yaqub alayhi salam, they became white out of sadness. It refers to him becoming blind. You can just imagine how much sadness he faced for years on end for him to lose his sight, right? The Quran also says bath. It uses the word bath, right? Which means, it actually means to spread out or to disseminate something, right? And this is a form of sadness which lingers on a person and it bears down on a person, and it makes this emotion, this is a state where a person, everything feels, the sadness feels like it's something very heavy. A person feels as though there's physical weight on him, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again speaks about Yaqub alayhi salam, and He says, Yaqub alayhi salam, he said to his family, قَالَ إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ, I complain of my sadness, bathi, grief, sadness, and my huzn, right? My sadness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Right? In here, Yaqub alayhi salam is telling, I'm not complaining to you, I'm feeling the sadness, but it's only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I air my sadness to. Again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we also find words such as waylun, asaf, etc., etc. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, He speaks about sadness and He says, وَلَا تَحِنُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ إِن كُنْتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. Do not grieve, do not feel weakened, and don't grieve. You will be superior if you are believers, right? The context of this is that after certain trials, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent this ayah down to the believers in Medina to console them, right? After certain mistakes that happened from them, which led to defeat and led to certain losses. Likewise, there are many ayahs in the Quran in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about, He discusses emotional states, but due to shortage of time, I'm not going to mention this. The final thing I will say is that we often hear this question of, is depression or sadness a form of weakness of faith? Right? Is depression, does it show that a person doesn't have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or there's something wrong with someone's faith? I will say that not necessarily, right? It's not a sign that someone has, because someone feels sadness or depression or grief, that this is weakness of faith. Although believing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and strengthening your faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala surely helps, right? But again, this is not a sign in and of itself. Firstly, emotions are created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and human temperament is created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And depression is an emotional state that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also created, right? Therefore, this state in and of itself is not a sign of a person's weakness. Now, just like Allah has created lust inside of us, and we have intense desires, we are told in the Quran not to completely stamp out lust and desires, but to challenge it in the correct avenues and to release it in the correct avenues. Similarly, depression is also a state, or sadness, grief is a state, that's emotion that's created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's impossible for us to never feel sad. But what we are taught is to channel this in the right avenue, right? And that is how, we use Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it gives us strength, right? To channel and overcome grief and sadness. Because no one's life is free from grief and sadness. Impossible. Doesn't matter who you are. You're going to feel grief and sadness. This is why the prophets and the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had an entire year which was known as Amul Huzn, the year of sadness or sorrow. Imagine this, an entire year where all he saw was suffering, loss, and and tough time and hardship. The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in and of itself, it's not a sign of weakness. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, this is a very, very beautiful ayah, and then I'm going to finish with this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about believers, right? And He describes a statement of the believers. The believers, they will say, وَقَالُوا الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ الَّذِي أَذْهَبَ عَنَّا الْحَزَنِ. That the believers say, all praise are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who removed from us sorrow and grief. إِنَّ رَبَّنَا لَغَفُورٌ شَكُورٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most forgiving. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most appreciative. Right? Allah is describing this, that first of all we should ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove our grief from us. If we are suffering, we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we seek strength in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us that grief is a temporary state. This is not the end result. Often people who are suffering from depression, they can't find ways, they can't think of how will they ever come out of this state. But Allah tells us that this is a temporary state, right? And we are not to lose hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We find strength in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah and our faith, right, certainly provides, and spirituality. There's so much studies that are done on this now, in which spirituality, right, provides people strength to overcome depression. And this ayah acknowledges that this world is full of trials, hardships and sorrows, and that we experience difficulties, but Allah is painting an optimistic future here, that we have something to look forward to, right? This is why the concept of the akhirah, Jannah, these are things that provide humans and believers hope, that okay, we might be suffering, but there's something better to look forward to, right? And it reminds us that depression and the dunya both are temporary, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what He has is far greater, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our master, and Allah has told us that Allah does not bear any soul with burden that it cannot, it cannot bear. So all souls, whatever test Allah gives us, we can bear it, no matter how difficult it seems. Here I will stop, and I will pass on the mic to Brother Nadeem Ahmed, who has, this is the second time he's come.